Take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let me tell you a story.
Brian barely remembered leaving the restaurant. 1 minute, he had been sitting inside a private dining room on the 42nd floor of a luxury hotel in downtown Chicago, listening to investors argue about mergers and market expansion. The next minute, he was outside in the cold air, staring at the city traffic, like somebody had unplugged him from his own body. His driver had offered to stop somewhere for food. Brian said no. He wasn't hungry. Truthfully, he hadn't felt much of anything lately. Not excitement, not anger, not even exhaustion anymore. Just noise. The kind that follows people who spend too much time pretending they're okay. His black suit still looked perfect, except for the loosened tie hanging around his collar. The Rolex on his wrist caught flashes of streetlight as he walked toward a 24-hour supermarket near his building. He only went inside because he forgot there was no coffee left in the penthouse. That was it. Coffee. Nothing important. The automatic doors opened slowly. Warm air brushed against his face. A teenage employee stocking shelves glanced at him, probably noticing the expensive suit at almost midnight. But Brian walked past without looking up. The store felt strangely quiet. Not peaceful, just tired. A cashier yawned near aisle 7. Some old man argued softly into a phone near frozen foods. A woman pushed a shopping cart with sleeping twins wrapped in blankets. Brian grabbed a basket without thinking. His mind drifted back to the dinner. Men laughing too loudly. Crystal glasses clinking. Someone praising him for closing another deal. Another person calling him unstoppable. Brian almost laughed thinking about it now. Unstoppable. Meanwhile, he couldn't remember the last full conversation he'd had that wasn't about business. He turned into the coffee aisle. Then he heard it. A baby crying. Not loud, not dramatic, just weak, tiny. Like the baby didn't even have enough energy left to cry properly. Brian paused, without knowing why. The sound came again. Soft, tired, human. For some reason, it pulled at something deep inside him. He looked toward customer service near the front entrance. At first, he only noticed the stroller, then the baby bottle sitting beside it. Then the woman standing at the counter holding a container of baby formula against her chest. Brian stopped moving. His fingers tightened slowly around the basket handle. No. His brain recognized her before his heart was ready to. Pamela. For a second, the entire store disappeared around him. He hadn't seen her in almost a year. Not properly. Not outside quick lawyer conversations and signed divorce documents pushed across polished tables. But this version of Pamela looked different from the woman he remembered. Not broken. That somehow would have hurt less. She looked exhausted. There were faint shadows under her eyes. Her hoodie hung loosely over her frame. One hand rested on the stroller, while the other gripped the baby formula tightly, like she was afraid somebody might take it from her. Brian stared at the baby. His chest tightened instantly. Their son. He looked bigger. Brian suddenly realized he didn't even know how much bigger. That thought hit harder than he expected. The cashier lowered her voice gently. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I can't process the refund after it's been opened." Pamela nodded quickly. Too quickly, like somebody used to hearing no. "Oh, okay," she said softly. She forced a small smile that disappeared almost immediately. Brian noticed the embarrassment before anything else. Not anger, not frustration. Embarrassment. Pamela opened her purse, checked inside, then checked again. Coins clinked quietly. A few folded receipts, an old pharmacy paper. Nothing else. She swallowed hard. The baby made another weak sound from the stroller. Pamela looked down immediately, brushing her fingers softly against the baby's blanket. "It's okay," she whispered automatically, even though nothing was okay. Brian felt something cold settle deep in his stomach, because suddenly all those expensive dinners, all those interviews, all those nights convincing himself life had simply moved on. Felt disgusting. Pamela cleared her throat and looked at the cashier again. Her voice came out smaller this time. "Can I just get the smaller one instead?" For a second, nobody answered her. The cashier looked uncomfortable, not rude, just helpless. She glanced toward the formula shelves, and then back at Pamela like she was trying to calculate whether kindness could somehow override store policy. "The smaller one is still $23, she said carefully. Pamela nodded again. That same quick little nod. Brian hated it immediately, because he remembered that nod. Pamela used to do it during arguments near the end of their marriage. That tiny movement she made whenever she was trying not to fall apart in front of somebody. The baby started crying again, still weak, still tired. Brian looked down at the stroller, and something inside him shifted violently. Their son's tiny fists moved against the blanket. His face was red from crying too long. One sock had slipped halfway off his foot. Brian suddenly realized he had no idea what size clothes his own child wore. That thought landed hard, harder than losing contracts, harder than public criticism, harder than the divorce paper. Pamela picked up the baby bottle beside the stroller and shook it gently. Empty. She looked away fast after realizing it, like she didn't want anybody noticing. But Brian noticed everything now. Every small movement, every exhausted breath, every quiet attempt to hide her struggle. And the worst part? She had probably been doing this alone for months. While he sat in luxury restaurants discussing stock prices with men who called him a genius, Brian felt heat crawl into his face. Not anger, shame, pure shame. The cashier lowered her voice again. I really am sorry. Pamela forced another smile. No, it's okay. I understand. But her fingers tightened around the formula container so hard her knuckles turned pale. That should have been the moment Brian walked over immediately. Instead, he stood frozen near the coffee aisle, staring at the woman he used to love more than anything, because his mind kept replaying pieces he had ignored before. Pamela asking him to stay home one night, instead of attending another networking dinner. Pamela sitting alone at the edge of their bed while he answered emails. Pamela saying quietly, "You're here, but you're not really here anymore." Back then, Brian thought she was being emotional, difficult, too demanding. Now he stood inside a supermarket at nearly midnight watching her struggle to buy baby formula, and suddenly every argument sounded different in his head. The baby cried harder this time. A few customers glanced over briefly before pretending not to notice. Pamela looked embarrassed again. That hurt Brian more than the crying, because Pamela always hated being pitied. Even during college, she refused help unless she absolutely needed it. Brian remembered the first apartment they shared years ago on the south side of Chicago. Tiny kitchen, broken heater, cheap furniture from thrift stores. Pamela laughing while dancing barefoot across the living room because they couldn't afford proper dates back then. They were broke, but they were together. Somewhere along the way, Brian became obsessed with never being poor again. And somewhere along the way, he stopped noticing what it was costing them. Pamela searched through her purse one more time. Coins, nothing else. She looked down at the stroller and smiled softly at the baby despite the exhaustion all over her face. That smile almost destroyed him. Because even now, even struggling, even embarrassed, she was still trying to comfort everyone around her. Brian finally moved. Slow steps, at first, like his body was unsure whether he deserved to walk toward her. The cashier noticed him immediately. Pamela didn't. Brian reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. Add it to my purchase. Pamela turned instantly. Her entire body stiffened the second she saw him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt heavy. Not dramatic, just painfully familiar. Brian suddenly became aware of how expensive he looked standing there. Tailored suit, luxury watch, fresh haircut. While Pamela stood in front of him, calculating baby formula sizes, her expression changed quickly. Shock first, then embarrassment, then something colder, pride. No, she said immediately. Quiet, firm. I'm not taking your money. The cashier awkwardly stepped back. Brian swallowed hard. It's just formula, Pamela. That's not the point. The baby cried again. Pamela closed her eyes briefly, like the sound physically hurt her now. Brian noticed how tired she looked up close. Not sleepy tired, life tired. The kind people carry silently because stopping isn't an option. And for the first time in a very long time, Brian had absolutely no idea what to say. Brian looked at the stroller again. Their son had finally stopped crying, but only because he looked exhausted now. His tiny face twitched restlessly against the blanket, while Pamela rubbed his stomach in slow circles. That simple movement hurt Brian more than any insult could have, because she did it automatically, without thinking, like she had spent months carrying every burden alone while he convinced himself sending money during the divorce settlement had somehow fulfilled his responsibility. Pamela kept her eyes away from his. I said no. Her voice stayed calm, but Brian noticed the tension in her jaw immediately. She was trying very hard not to break in public. Brian lowered his voice. "Pamela, no." This time, she looked directly at him, and for a second, he saw the woman from before. Not the exhausted mother standing in a supermarket after midnight. The Pamela who used to challenge him without hesitation. The Pamela who once sat across from him at a diner at 2 a.m, arguing about music for nearly an hour because she refused to admit his playlist was terrible. That version of her still existed somewhere underneath all this exhaustion, which somehow made everything worse. The cashier shifted awkwardly beside them. A man pushing a cart slowed down near customer service before realizing tension was building, and quickly moved away. Pamela looked embarrassed again. Brian hated himself for being part of the reason. He spoke carefully. "Just let me help." Pamela laughed softly, not because anything was funny. It sounded tired. "You want to help now?" That sentence landed harder than she probably intended. Brian opened his mouth. Nothing came out, because honestly, she had every right to ask that. Pamela adjusted the baby blanket gently. "He's hungry, Brian. I'm not doing this with you tonight." The baby moved again, making tiny, restless sounds. Brian stared at him quietly. His son. His chest tightened all over again. The last time he had held the baby, he was still small enough to sleep against Brian's shoulder during the divorce discussions. Brian remembered handing him back too quickly because his phone kept vibrating with work calls. At the time, he told himself he was handling important business. Standing here now, that memory made him feel sick. Pamela finally placed the formula container on the counter. "Can you hold this for me?" she asked the cashier softly. "I just need a minute." The cashier nodded sympathetically. Pamela grabbed the stroller handle and started walking toward the exit. Brian reacted instantly. "Pamela." She kept moving. The automatic doors opened. Cold Chicago air rushed inside briefly. Brian followed her outside before he could think better of it. The city felt quieter now. Streetlights reflected off wet pavement from earlier rain. Cars moved through the intersection nearby while wind brushed against Pamela's hoodie. She stopped beside the stroller without turning around. Brian stayed a few feet behind her. Neither spoke immediately. Pamela wiped beneath her eye quickly before facing him again. That small movement nearly broke him. Not because she was crying, because she clearly didn't want him seeing it. "I had it handled," she said softly. Brian looked at her for a long moment, then finally answered with complete honesty. "No, you didn't." Pamela flinched slightly, not from cruelty, from exhaustion. Brian stepped closer carefully. "I didn't know things were this bad." Pamela stared at him in disbelief for almost 3 seconds. Then she laughed again, that same tired laugh. "You didn't know because you never asked." Silence, heavy, painfully deserved. Brian looked down. For the first time in years, there was no perfect response waiting in his mouth. No polished explanation, no business solution, just guilt, raw and ugly. The baby started crying again. Pamela immediately leaned over the stroller, trying to calm him. Brian watched her trembling hands for a second before speaking quietly. "Please." Pamela didn't answer. "Let me buy the formula." She stayed silent long enough that Brian thought she might walk away again. Then finally, without looking at him, she whispered, "Just this once." Brian closed his eyes briefly. That sentence should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt like failure, because deep down he realized something terrifying in that moment. Pamela had learned how to survive without him, and he had no idea whether she still wanted him in her life at all. Welcome back to Mr. Georges Stories, where life's most powerful lessons come wrapped in unforgettable tales. If you're new to this family, thank you for joining us. Please hit the subscribe button because it helps us share stories like this on YouTube. And before we continue, tell me in the comments, do you think love can survive emotional neglect? Or are some wounds simply too deep once silence replaces effort? Brian walked back into the supermarket alone. Pamela stayed outside beside the stroller. The automatic doors closed behind him, muting the city noise for a moment. He grabbed the formula container from customer service, while the cashier avoided making eye contact out of respect more than discomfort now. "You're good," she said quietly after scanning it. Brian nodded once. That should have been a simple moment. A quick purchase, a card tap, done. Instead, Standing there holding baby formula in his hands felt heavier than signing million-dollar contracts ever had, because this was real, not numbers, not presentations, not applause from people who only valued him when he produced something. Real life, real hunger, real exhaustion. Brian walked back outside slowly. Pamela stood near the curb, rocking the stroller gently with one hand, while pulling her hoodie tighter against the cold wind. Chicago traffic rolled past behind her. Most drivers never looked twice. Just another tired mother standing outside at midnight. That thought bothered Brian immediately, because Pamela had never been invisible to him before. Back when they first met, she walked into every room carrying warmth with her naturally. She laughed loudly, talked with her hands, pulled strangers into conversations like old friends. Now she barely looked up from the stroller. Brian handed her the bag carefully. Pamela took it without speaking. "Thank you," she finally said, polite, distant. That hurt more than anger would have. Brian shoved his hands into his coat pockets. "You taking the bus?" Pamela hesitated before answering. "Yes." Brian looked down the street automatically. The next bus stop sat half a block away under flickering streetlights. "You shouldn't be out here this late with the baby." Pamela gave him a tired look. "Most people don't get to choose convenient hours." The sentence wasn't loud. Still, Brian felt it land directly in his chest, because she wasn't trying to insult him. She was simply telling the truth. A cold gust of wind swept through the street. Pamela leaned over the stroller immediately, adjusting the baby blanket more securely around their son. That instinctive movement pulled Brian's attention again. Every single thing she did centered around protecting the baby. Meanwhile, Brian couldn't even remember the last pediatric appointment date. The silence stretched awkwardly. Finally, Brian spoke again. "Let me drive you home." Pamela answered immediately. "No, at least let me call." "I said no, Brian." A bus engine rumbled somewhere in the distance. Pamela glanced toward the corner. Brian studied her face quietly under the streetlights. She looked thinner, not unhealthy, just worn down, like rest had become something temporary instead of normal. And suddenly, another memory surfaced without warning. 3 years earlier, Pamela sitting across from him inside their kitchen while cold takeout containers sat untouched between them. Brian typing emails during dinner. Pamela watching him quietly for almost a full minute before speaking. "Can you put the phone down for 10 minutes? Brian barely looked up. "This client's in Tokyo. I can't ignore him." Pamela leaned back in her chair slowly. "You ignore me pretty easily." At the time, Brian got defensive immediately. Now standing outside this supermarket, he remembered something else. Pamela hadn't sounded angry that night. She sounded lonely. That realization stayed with him harder than the memory itself. The bus headlights appeared at the end of the street. Pamela adjusted the stroller handle. Brian reacted before thinking. "Pamela, wait." She stopped, but didn't fully turn around. Brian struggled for the right words. For maybe the first time in years, he didn't have polished answers ready. "I didn't know things got this hard." Pamela looked down briefly. Then she gave a small shrug that almost looked apologetic. "That's the thing about struggling quietly," she said softly. "People usually don't notice until it's too late." The bus pulled up beside the curb with a loud hiss of air brakes. Pamela reached for the stroller. Brian stood frozen beside her, watching, realizing he didn't want her disappearing again. Brian watched as Pamela carefully lifted the stroller wheels onto the bus. The driver lowered the ramp halfway without complaint. Pamela thanked him softly before maneuvering the baby inside with practiced movements that made one thing painfully obvious. She had been doing this alone for a long time. Brian stayed on the sidewalk for half a second too long, then made a decision. He climbed onto the bus just before the doors closed. Pamela turned immediately. "What are you doing?" "I'm riding with you." "No, you're not." The driver glanced between them briefly, clearly deciding this wasn't his business. Brian ignored the look and tapped his card near the entrance. Pamela's expression tightened. "You don't need to do this." Brian answered quietly. "I know." That response seemed to catch her off guard for a second. The bus jerked forward roughly, forcing Brian to grab a nearby pole to steady himself. Pamela moved the stroller into the wheelchair space near the center aisle and locked the wheels carefully. Their son had finally fallen asleep. Tiny breaths, relaxed face, one small hand resting outside the blanket. Brian stared longer than he meant to. Pamela noticed. "You can sit down," she said softly, though the distance in her voice remained. Brian sat across from her. For a moment, neither spoke. The bus moved through downtown Chicago, while advertisements reflected against the windows in blurred colors. A few exhausted passengers stared into their phones. Somebody near the back coughed repeatedly into their sleeve. Normal life. The kind Brian rarely saw anymore. His world existed inside private elevators, black cars, rooftop meetings, and restaurants where nobody discussed bills out loud. Pamela's world still moved among ordinary people trying to survive another week. That contrast made him uncomfortable in ways he couldn't explain yet. Pamela adjusted the diaper bag beside her feet. Brian noticed the zipper was broken. Another thing he had somehow never imagined her dealing with. "You could have called me," he said finally. Pamela looked out the window. "For what?" Brian frowned slightly. "For help?" That answer earned him a tired look. "Brian, during our marriage, I spent years asking you for help." He opened his mouth instantly. She cut him off before he could defend himself. "Not money." The bus grew quieter around them. Pamela's voice stayed calm, but every word carried old exhaustion beneath it. "I asked you to slow down." Brian looked away. "I asked you to come home before midnight sometimes." His jaw tightened. "I asked you to sit through one dinner without checking your phone every 3 minutes. A long silence followed. Brian rubbed his hand against his mouth slowly. Because the painful part was this, he remembered every single conversation. At the time, he always believed he had reasonable explanations. Business pressure, investors, expansion deadlines, responsibility. Now those excuses sounded hollow sitting across from Pamela on a city bus after midnight, while their child slept between them. The bus stopped near a traffic light. Outside, a group of young professionals laughed loudly while leaving a sports bar. One man loosened his tie, while another nearly dropped a pizza box. Brian watched them absent-mindedly. Then another memory surfaced. Pamela sitting alone at his birthday dinner 2 years earlier. Friends talking around them. Brian standing near another table, taking a business call for nearly 40 minutes. When he finally returned, Pamela smiled politely in front of everyone. But later that night, after guests left, she sat quietly removing earrings in front of the bathroom mirror. "Do you know what hurts the most?" she asked. Brian remembered feeling irritated already. "Pamela, not tonight." She looked at him through the mirror, not angry, just tired. "I keep lowering my expectations just to feel close to you." Back then, Brian thought she was being dramatic. Now the memory made his chest ache. The bus turned onto a quieter street. Pamela suddenly spoke again without looking at him. "You know what the crazy part is?" Brian lifted his eyes toward her. "I defended you for a long time." That surprised him. Pamela gave a small, humorless laugh. "My friends used to say you were emotionally unavailable." She paused. "I kept telling everybody you were just stressed." Brian swallowed hard. Pamela finally looked directly at him again. "I spent years protecting the version of you that stopped protecting us." Brian did not answer immediately. Pamela stood near the kitchen, holding the baby against her shoulder, while warming the bottle carefully beneath running water. "You should probably go home, Brian." The sentence stayed hanging between them, soft, not cruel, which somehow made it harder to hear. Brian looked around the apartment again, quietly. The place was small enough that he could see almost everything from where he stood near the entrance. A folded stroller near the couch, baby wipes stacked beside children's medicine, laundry drying near a portable heater. One framed photo sitting beside the television caught his attention immediately. Pamela holding the baby outside near Lake Michigan during summer, both smiling. Brian wasn't in the picture. That realization settled heavily inside his chest. Pamela finally sat down carefully on the couch and began feeding the baby. The crying stopped almost instantly. The apartment became quiet, except for occasional traffic sounds outside. Brian watched from across the room. The baby's tiny hand rested against Pamela's hoodie, while drinking from the bottle slowly. Pamela looked exhausted. Still, she kept rubbing small circles against the baby's back between pauses, like comfort had become instinct for her now. Brian suddenly remembered something he hadn't thought about in years. Their old apartment, during their first year of marriage. Pamela sitting cross-legged on the kitchen counter, eating cereal at midnight, while laughing at some terrible reality show. Back then, Brian used to sit beside her talking for hours about future plans. He remembered promising her things, not luxury, Not money, presence. That word echoed painfully in his head now. Presence. Somewhere along the way, ambition replaced intimacy so gradually Brian never noticed it happening. He worked later, missed dinners more often, canceled weekends, started answering emails during conversations. Pamela complained at first. Then, eventually, she stopped complaining, and that should have scared him more than it did. Pamela looked up suddenly. "You're staring." Brian blinked slightly. "Sorry, you don't have to look guilty." Every 5 seconds, Brian gave a faint, humorless laugh. "I'm trying not to." Pamela adjusted the baby against her shoulder again. "Well, it's noticeable." For a second, the tension softened just enough to feel familiar. Not romantic, just human. Brian slowly loosened his tie completely and sat in the chair near the window. The silence between them felt different now, less sharp, still uncomfortable, but real. Not the cold silence they used to have near the end of the marriage where both pretended everything was fine because neither wanted another exhausting argument. Brian rubbed his hands together slowly. "You look tired." Pamela looked down at the baby bottle. "That's usually what happens when people don't sleep." The response carried dry humor beneath the exhaustion. Brian almost smiled despite himself. Almost. Then his eyes drifted toward the kitchen sink. 3 ramen noodle cups sat inside the trash bin. His stomach tightened immediately. Pamela noticed where he was looking. Before he could speak, she answered quietly. "Some weeks are harder than others." Brian leaned back slowly in the chair. Something about hearing that nearly broke him. Because Pamela said it casually, like struggle had become normal enough to discuss without emotion now. That frightened him more than tears would have. His gaze shifted again. A stack of unopened bills near the microwave. Baby medicine beside generic cereal boxes. A pair of worn sneakers drying near the radiator. None of it matched the woman Brian remembered building dreams with years ago. And the worst part? Pamela never once asked him for rescue. Not tonight. Not during the divorce. Not even now. She simply adapted, endured, carried everything quietly. Brian suddenly thought about his penthouse downtown. Floor-to-ceiling windows, imported furniture, wine collections nobody touched, a refrigerator full of expensive food he barely ate. The silence inside that place suddenly felt unbearable compared to this apartment filled with exhaustion and warmth at the same time. The baby finally finished the bottle and began drifting back to sleep against Pamela's chest. Pamela closed her eyes briefly while holding him, just 3 seconds. But Brian noticed immediately. Those tiny moments of rest probably mattered now. She opened her eyes again and caught him watching. "What?" Brian hesitated, then answered honestly, "I didn't know things got this bad." Pamela looked at him for a long moment, not angry, not emotional, just tired enough to stop pretending. Then quietly she said, "That's because you stopped looking a long time ago." Brian did not sleep that night. The penthouse felt unbearable the moment he walked inside. Usually, the silence there made him feel successful, important, untouchable. Tonight, it felt hollow. He loosened his cuffs slowly while walking through the living room. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked downtown Chicago, glowing beneath the early morning darkness. But Brian barely noticed the view anymore. His eyes kept drifting back to the image of Pamela warming baby formula inside that tiny apartment. The contrast disturbed him, not because the apartment was small, because Pamela somehow carried more emotional strength inside that cramped space than Brian had felt in years, surrounded by wealth. He poured himself water in the kitchen and stopped halfway through, drinking it. The refrigerator was packed. Imported fruit, prepared meals, expensive bottled drinks, food everywhere. Brian suddenly remembered the ramen cups sitting in Pamela's trash bin. His appetite disappeared instantly. He set the glass down untouched. Around 4 a.m, Brian sat on the edge of his bed, scrolling through old emails instead of sleeping. At first, he told himself he was checking work schedules. Truthfully, he was searching for something else. Evidence. Proof that he had not completely failed his family. But the deeper he looked through old messages, the worse he felt. Missed dinner, canceled trips, assistant reminders about anniversaries, voicemails from Pamela, asking if he would make it home before the baby's doctor appointment. His responses were always short. "Busy tonight, running late, important client dinner, we'll talk tomorrow." Tomorrow. Brian rubbed his face slowly. That word had quietly destroyed more of his marriage than he realized, because eventually tomorrow stopped meaning anything. His phone buzzed against the nightstand. Another investor email. Brian ignored it. That alone would have shocked most people around him. By 7 in the morning, he was still awake. He showered, dressed, and left the penthouse without calling his driver. For once, Brian wanted to move through the city without people preparing everything for him, without assistance, without schedules, without somebody handing him the next task before he could think. He ended up near a pawn shop 3 neighborhoods away from Pamela's apartment almost by accident. At least, that's what he told himself. The storefront looked old, but busy. Jewelry displays sat behind scratched glass, while handwritten signs advertised quick cash payments. Brian slowed his steps unconsciously, then stopped completely, because sitting in the display case near the register was Pamela's bracelet. His stomach dropped immediately. Silver with tiny blue stones. Not expensive, but he recognized it instantly because he bought it during their second year together, before money changed everything. Pamela used to wear it almost every day. Brian stared through the glass quietly. A man behind the counter noticed him looking. "You interested in it?" Brian swallowed once. "How long has that been here?" The man shrugged casually. "Couple months, maybe." Brian couldn't answer right away. Couple months. Meaning Pamela sold it while he was busy attending charity galas and corporate dinners pretending his life remained under control. The realization sat heavy inside him. Because Pamela loved that bracelet, not for the price, for the memory attached to it. Brian remembered giving it to her after they spent an entire winter sharing one broken heater in their first apartment. Pamela laughed for nearly 5 minutes after opening the tiny box, because she thought Brian looked more nervous than when he proposed later. And somehow, while he measured success through numbers and headlines, Pamela had quietly started selling pieces of her life to survive. Brian stepped back from the window slowly. For the first time in years, he felt genuinely disgusted with himself. Brian stopped going to the office regularly after that week. Not completely, but enough for people to notice. His assistant started scheduling fewer public appearances, because Brian kept canceling dinners, interviews, and networking events without explanation. Rumors quietly started circulating inside the company. Stress, burnout, possible acquisition pressure. Nobody guessed the truth. Nobody guessed that the most successful man in the room had suddenly become haunted by a woman buying discounted oatmeal and walking home in cold weather with a stroller. Brian sat inside his office late one evening, staring at the city through the glass walls. The building usually made him feel powerful. Tonight it felt cold. A half-finished espresso sat untouched near stacks of contracts, while downtown Chicago glowed beneath the dark sky outside. Brian loosened his collar slowly. Then his eyes landed on something near the corner bookshelf, a framed magazine cover. Him smiling beside investors after closing one of the biggest deals of his career. Brian walked toward it slowly. He remembered that night clearly now, not because of the deal, because Pamela cried in the bathroom afterward. At the time, he thought she was overreacting. Now the memory made him uncomfortable for reasons he couldn't escape anymore. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Brian turned slightly. His assistant stepped inside, holding a folder. "You still here?" Brian nodded once. Unfortunately, that answer surprised her enough to almost smile. She placed the folder down carefully. "You missed another investor dinner." "I know." A brief silence followed. Then she hesitated. "Can I ask something without you getting defensive?" Brian leaned against the desk, tiredly. "That depends." She crossed her arms lightly. "What happened to you lately?" Brian almost gave the usual corporate answer. "Stress, too much work, need rest." But something about pretending suddenly felt exhausting. So instead, he looked down at the floor, briefly, then admitted quietly, "I think I missed something important while I was busy chasing everything else." His assistant studied him for a moment. Not judgmental, just thoughtful. Then she sat down slowly across from him. "You know," she said carefully, "Pamela came here once." Brian looked up instantly. "What?" "She didn't come upstairs." Her voice softened slightly, "but she was here." Brian stared at her. The room suddenly felt too quiet. "When?" His assistant thought for a second. "Maybe 8 months ago." 8 months. That meant after the divorce paperwork started becoming ugly. After public gossip websites began discussing Brian's personal life constantly. Brian's stomach tightened. "She came to see me." She asked reception if you were busy. Brian's chest felt strangely heavy now. What happened? His assistant hesitated again, then sighed softly. There were photographers outside that day. Brian immediately remembered. Major investor meeting. Press everywhere. Public attention. He had spent the afternoon downstairs greeting clients and smiling for cameras like his personal life wasn't collapsing behind closed doors. She saw you outside with investors, his assistant continued quietly. Then she changed her mind. Brian didn't move, didn't speak. His assistant watched his face carefully before adding, "She looked embarrassed for even being there." That sentence hit him harder than anything else. Embarrassed. Not angry, not dramatic. Embarrassed. Brian slowly sat down in his chair. Something inside him started sinking deeper by the second, because suddenly he could see it clearly now. Pamela standing somewhere inside the lobby, holding her pride together, while photographers crowded around the building outside. Seeing Brian laughing beside wealthy executives, looking successful, important, untouchable, while she quietly needed help. Brian pressed his hand against his mouth slowly. His assistant lowered her voice further. She left before I could even go downstairs. The room became painfully still, and for the first time in years, Brian genuinely hated the man he used to be. Brian sat in his car outside Pamela's apartment building for nearly 20 minutes before finally getting out, not because he was unsure where he was, because for the first time in years, he had no idea how to approach a conversation without hiding behind status, solutions, or control. The evening air carried the smell of rain against warm concrete, while distant music drifted from somewhere down the block. Brian looked up toward Pamela's apartment window. The kitchen light was on. He could see movement inside occasionally, a shadow passing, stopping, moving again. Normal life, simple life, real life. His stomach tightened unexpectedly. He walked toward the entrance, slowly carrying 2 grocery bags in one hand. Nothing extravagant, no expensive gifts, no dramatic gestures, just groceries, milk, fruit, diapers, baby wipes, bread, things Pamela actually needed. Brian almost laughed bitterly at himself while climbing the stairs. Years ago, he would have tried solving this situation with luxury, a bigger apartment, a credit card, some expensive apology disguised as generosity. Now he was beginning to understand something painfully simple. Pamela never wanted to be impressed. She wanted to feel chosen. He reached the apartment door and hesitated briefly before knocking. A few seconds passed, then footsteps approached. Pamela opened the door carefully, still holding the baby against her shoulder. The moment she saw Brian standing there again, surprise crossed her face first, then caution settled right behind it. "You came back." Brian lifted the grocery bag slightly. "I wasn't sure what you needed, so I just guessed." Pamela looked at the bags, then at him. "You didn't have to do that. I know." That answer made her pause again. Brian noticed immediately that Pamela looked slightly more rested tonight. Not fully rested, just less overwhelmed than the supermarket night. Her hair was tied loosely now, and one sleeve of her sweatshirt had tiny formula stains near the wrist. Small details, human details. Brian found himself noticing everything lately. Pamela stepped aside slowly. "Come in before the baby starts crying from the cold." Brian entered quietly. The apartment smelled faintly like baby lotion and food warming on the stove. Something simmered inside a small pot near the kitchen counter. Soup, maybe. The television played softly in the background, though Pamela clearly wasn't watching it. Brian set the grocery bags carefully near the kitchen. Pamela immediately noticed the diaper. "You bought the expensive brand." Brian blinked. "There's a cheaper one?" Pamela stared at him for 1 second, then laughed, suddenly. A real laugh this time. Short, exhausted, but real. Brian looked genuinely confused. Pamela shook her head while adjusting the baby higher against her shoulder. "You really don't know anything about this stuff, do you?" Brian rubbed the back of his neck, awkwardly. "I'm starting to realize that." The baby suddenly made a loud, unhappy sound between them. Pamela sighed softly. Okay. I hear you." Brian watched her gently bounce the baby against her shoulder while walking small circles through the apartment. The movement looked automatic now, natural, practiced. He noticed how quickly Pamela recognized every tiny sound the baby made. One cry meant hunger. Another meant discomfort. Another meant exhaustion. Brian realized he couldn't tell the difference yet, and instead of feeling defensive about it, he felt ashamed. Pamela finally sat carefully on the couch again. The baby settled after a minute. Brian remained standing awkwardly near the kitchen until Pamela glanced up. "You can sit down, Brian. You're making this feel like a job interview." That almost made him smile. Almost. He sat across from her, quietly. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Pamela looked at him directly and asked the question he probably deserved. "So why are you really here?" Brian discovered very quickly that babies did not care about status, not net worth, not tailored suits, not magazine covers. None of it mattered, especially at 3 in the morning. The baby started crying before sunrise on Brian's third overnight visit to Pamela's apartment. At first, Brian thought Pamela would automatically get up like she always did. Instead, her tired voice came from beneath the blanket. "Your turn." Brian blinked into darkness. "My what?" Pamela didn't even open her eyes. "Your turn, millionaire." Brian sat upright slowly, while the crying grew louder from the portable crib beside the couch. He rubbed his face hard. "What does he need?" Pamela pointed lazily toward the kitchen without moving. "Bottle first, then diaper. And if you put the diaper on backward again, I'm recording it this time." Brian stared at her. "You said you deleted that video." Pamela finally laughed softly into the pillow. "I lied." Despite the exhaustion in his body, Brian felt the corner of his mouth twitch slightly. That alone felt unfamiliar lately. He stood up carefully and walked toward the crib. The baby immediately started crying harder once Brian lifted him awkwardly. Okay, Brian muttered nervously. "Why does he get louder when I touch him?" Pamela's muffled voice answered from the couch. "Because babies can sense fear." Brian shot her an offended look. Pamela still refused to open her eyes. "You'll survive." The kitchen light flicked on. Brian held the baby with all the confidence of a man transporting unstable explosives. The bottle warmer confused him immediately. Too many buttons, too many settings. Why did warming milk require instructions? Behind him, Pamela quietly watched through half-open eyes, while pretending not to. Brian finally managed to prepare the bottle after nearly dropping the cap twice. Then came the diaper. 5 minutes later. Why is he moving this much? Pamela burst into exhausted laughter from the couch. "Brian, he's a baby, not office furniture." "I'm serious." "So am I." Brian struggled with the diaper tabs, while the baby kicked aggressively against his expensive shirt. Then suddenly, Brian froze. Pamela immediately noticed. "What happened?" Brian looked horrified. "Oh no." Pamela sat up instantly. "Oh, that's definitely bad." "What does that mean?" "It means congratulations." Brian stared at her. "For what?" "You waited too long." 2 seconds later, Brian stumbled backward dramatically. "Jesus Christ." Pamela laughed so hard she nearly dropped the blanket off her lap. Real laughter. The kind Brian had not heard from her in years. Not polite laughter around guests. Not tired, forced amusement. Real laughter. Brian looked down at his ruined shirt in disbelief. This should not legally come out of something that small. Pamela covered her mouth, trying to breathe normally again. "Oh my God." Brian pointed accusingly toward the baby. He looked peaceful. That was deceptive. The baby suddenly smiled. Actually smiled. Tiny, brief, but enough to completely disarm Brian mid-complaint. Pamela saw the exact second Brian's expression changed. His shoulders softened immediately. The frustration disappeared from his face like somebody switched it off. Brian stared down at the baby quietly. "Well, that feels manipulative." Pamela smiled at him gently now. "Yeah," she said softly. "That's how they get you." For a moment, the apartment felt lighter than it had in a very long time. Not fixed, not healed, but warmer. And Brian slowly started understanding something important. Fatherhood was not about providing perfect solutions. Sometimes it was just about staying in the room long enough to learn. Brian noticed it during the pediatric appointment. The baby calmed instantly in Pamela's arms, but the second Brian held him too stiffly. Crying, immediate, loud. Brian looked personally offended by it. "I don't understand. I'm supporting the head correctly." Pamela tried not to laugh while signing paperwork at the reception desk. "You're holding him like a hostage negotiation." "I'm being careful." "You're being terrified." Brian looked down at the baby squirming against his chest. "I pay people to manage billion-dollar investments." Pamela finally looked up. "And yet this 7-pound human is defeating you." The baby cried harder. An older woman sitting nearby smiled knowingly at Brian's suffering. Brian sighed deeply. This feels targeted. Pamela reached for the baby gently. Here. The moment the baby settled against her shoulder, silence. Brian stared at them both in disbelief. That's rude. Pamela laughed softly while rubbing the baby's back. You're impatient. I'm not impatient. You checked the bottle temperature 6 times yesterday. Brian defended himself immediately. It was hot. It was warm. It felt aggressive. Pamela shook her head, smiling. The doctor finally called them inside. Brian followed behind Pamela, carrying the diaper bag awkwardly over one shoulder. At some point, he had started carrying it automatically without realizing. That small detail would have shocked the old version of him. Inside the examination room, Brian stood quietly while Pamela answered questions from memory. Feeding schedules, sleeping patterns, medication timing, recent symptoms. Brian listened carefully, not because he wanted to impress Pamela, because he genuinely didn't know most of the answers. That realization humbled him more every day. The doctor asked another routine question. Any recent fevers? Pamela answered immediately. Just once, last Thursday night. But it went down after the medicine. Brian looked at her. Last Thursday. He had no idea the baby even got sick. Because last Thursday, he had been attending some corporate charity event, shaking hands beside photographers, while Pamela handled everything alone again. The guilt hit quickly, but this time, Brian didn't sit inside it. Instead, he paid attention, real attention. The doctor continued talking about feeding adjustments and sleep development, while Brian mentally memorized every detail. Pamela noticed him listening carefully now. That mattered more than she expected. After the appointment ended, they stepped back outside into the afternoon cold. Pamela adjusted the baby blanket inside the stroller, while Brian walked beside her toward the sidewalk. You were quiet in there, she said. Brian shoved his hands into his coat pockets. I realized I don't know enough. Pamela glanced at him briefly. You're learning slowly. That's still learning. They stopped near a crosswalk while traffic moved through the intersection. Brian looked down at the stroller again. The baby blinked sleepily beneath the blanket before grabbing one of Brian's fingers unexpectedly. Tiny hand, strong grip. Brian froze for half a second. Pamela noticed immediately. Something softened across Brian's face. So naturally, it almost caught her off guard. No corporate mask, no performance, just emotion. The baby held onto his finger like it belonged there. Brian swallowed quietly. Pamela looked away first, because moments like that made things complicated emotionally. The crosswalk signal changed. They started walking again. Brian spoke after a long silence. I used to think providing financially was enough. Pamela kept her eyes ahead. A lot of men think that. Brian nodded slowly. I honestly believed working harder meant loving harder. Pamela looked down at the stroller. That's because nobody teaches men emotional responsibility properly. The sentence stayed with Brian the entire walk, because she didn't sound angry saying it, just honest. And somewhere between doctor visits, diaper disasters, and carrying a diaper bag through Chicago streets, Brian slowly began understanding a truth success had hidden from him for years. Some of the most important parts of life cannot be outsourced. Rain tapped softly against the apartment windows that night. Not heavy, just steady enough to make the city outside sound distant. Pamela sat curled into the corner of the couch with the baby sleeping against her chest, while some late-night cooking show played quietly on television. Brian stood near the kitchen, rinsing bottles carefully. At first, Pamela laughed when he insisted on helping. Then she noticed he was actually paying attention now, checking temperatures properly, separating clean bottles from used ones, reading instructions, instead of pretending he already knew everything. That mattered more than he realized. You missed soap, Pamela murmured sleepily from the couch. Brian looked offended immediately. I absolutely did not. Pamela barely lifted one finger toward the sink. Left side. Brian checked. Pause. I hate this kitchen. Pamela smiled, without opening her eyes fully. Brian rinsed the bottle again, while the television audience applauded something loudly in the background. The apartment felt calm tonight, not emotionally tense like before, not fixed either, just softer around the edges. Brian dried his hands slowly and glanced toward the couch again. Pamela looked exhausted in a different way now, not overwhelmed, worn down. The kind of exhaustion that settles deep into people after carrying responsibility too long without rest. The baby slept peacefully against her chest, while Pamela's head leaned slightly against the couch cushion. Brian noticed her blinking slower every few seconds. "You should sleep," he said quietly. Pamela shook her head faintly. "I still need to fold laundry." Brian looked toward the basket near the heater. Tiny baby clothes overflowed from the top. "I'll do it." Pamela opened one eye suspiciously. "You don't know how hard can folding tiny shirts be?" Pamela gave him a tired look. "That confidence worries me." Brian walked toward the laundry basket anyway. 5 minutes later. "Why are the socks so small?" Pamela laughed softly beneath the blanket. "Because his feet are small, Brian. There's no structural integrity to these things. You're arguing with baby socks." Brian held one up between two fingers. "This can't be a real piece of clothing." Pamela laughed again, quieter this time, sleepier. Brian glanced toward her automatically. The sound had changed, softer now, heavy with exhaustion. He slowed his folding slightly. Pamela adjusted the baby gently against her shoulder before her eyes drifted closed for a few seconds, then opened again immediately, like her body no longer trusted itself to fully rest. Brian noticed that too, and something about it hurt deeply, because even while exhausted, Pamela still seemed mentally alert for the baby every second, always listening, always half awake. Always ready. Brian finished folding the last tiny shirt badly and placed it beside the basket. "You fold like a rich uncle trying to impress relatives," Pamela mumbled weakly. "That feels oddly specific." Brian smiled faintly. Then the apartment grew quiet again. Television noise. Rain outside. The baby breathing softly. Brian sat down carefully in the chair near the couch. Pamela's eyes stayed closed longer this time. A full minute passed. Then another. Eventually, her breathing deepened slightly. Brian realized she had finally fallen asleep, not intentionally. Her body had simply given up. First, the baby remained sleeping peacefully against her chest. Pamela's hand still rested protectively across his back even in sleep. Brian stared quietly. Something about the scene completely undid him emotionally, not because it looked dramatic, because it looked familiar, routine. This was probably how countless nights looked after he stopped paying attention during the marriage. Pamela exhausted on the couch, holding everything together silently, while he buried himself inside work downstairs or behind another glowing phone screen. Brian swallowed hard and looked away briefly, then back again. Pamela never complained loudly enough for people to call her difficult. That was part of the problem. She endured quietly, and people often mistake quiet suffering for strength that doesn't need help. Pamela noticed the changes long before she admitted them out loud. Brian started arriving when he said he would. That alone felt unfamiliar. No last-minute cancellations. No assistant calling with excuses. No sudden important meeting texts 20 minutes before dinner. If Brian said 6 o'clock, he appeared at 6, sometimes early. And strangely, that consistency made Pamela more nervous than the old version of him, because disappointment had taught her not to trust improvement too quickly. One rainy Thursday evening, Brian stood inside her kitchen staring aggressively at a frying pan, like it had personally offended him. Pamela sat on the couch feeding the baby while quietly observing the situation. "You're burning it," she finally said. Brian looked over immediately. "It's supposed to look like this." Pamela raised one eyebrow slowly. "The smoke suggests otherwise." Brian glanced back at the stove. The smoke had in fact become concerning. He lowered the heat quickly. "I'm adapting." "You're committing a crime against chicken." Brian sighed dramatically while reaching for the spatula again. "You know, normal people appreciate effort." Pamela adjusted the baby bottle. "Normal people season their food." Brian pointed toward the counter defensively. "There's seasoning right there." Pamela looked at the untouched spices beside him, then back at him, decoratively. Brian laughed, despite himself. That still surprised her sometimes. Not the sound itself, the ease of it. Back during the final year of their marriage, Brian rarely laughed naturally anymore, unless cameras or clients were around. At home, he mostly looked distracted. Elsewhere, mentally, even sitting beside her. Now he stood in her kitchen arguing with Paprika, while smoke drifted toward the ceiling. Life felt strange sometimes. Brian finally plated the food with cautious confidence. Pamela examined it carefully from the couch. The baby made a tiny, sleepy sound against her chest. Brian waited nervously while Pamela took one bite. Then, immediately reached for water. Brian looked offended. That bad? Pamela tried to answer seriously. Failed completely. You cooked stress. Brian dropped his head briefly against the refrigerator. That's not even a real flavor. It is now. The baby startled slightly from Pamela's laughter. Brian watched her carefully after that. There were still tired days, still guarded moments, still emotional distance she kept between them instinctively. But lately, Pamela laughed more often. Not constantly, just enough for Brian to notice. And every single time, something inside him softened quietly. Pamela eventually set the plate down. It's terrible, she admitted honestly. Brian folded his arms. Wow. No encouragement at all. But Pamela paused. You showed up. Brian looked at her differently after that, because he understood what she really meant. The food didn't matter. The effort did. Pamela adjusted the baby gently before continuing. You used to think fixing problems meant spending money. Brian leaned against the counter quietly. I know. You'd buy gifts after arguments instead of actually listening. He nodded once. Still listening. No defensiveness. Pamela noticed that too. That was new. You know what used to make me angriest? She asked softly. Brian looked up carefully. What? You always acted shocked that I felt lonely. The apartment grew quieter after that. Rain tapping against windows. Baby breathing softly. A pan cooling on the stove. Brian lowered his eyes briefly. Not ashamed in the dramatic way he used to be. Just honest now. I didn't understand emotional neglect back then. Pamela studied him for a second. Do you now? Brian looked toward the baby sleeping peacefully against her chest, then back at Pamela. Yeah, he said quietly. I think I'm finally starting to. Brian realized very quickly that Pamela's world operated differently from his. Not better, not worse, just human. In ways he had forgotten. The realization hit hardest during a Saturday family cookout on the South Side. Pamela almost didn't invite him. Brian could tell. She spent nearly 3 minutes pretending to reorganize the diaper bag before finally speaking. You don't have to come if you're busy. Brian looked up from fastening the stroller buckle. I'm not busy. Pamela hesitated. It's not really your kind of environment. That answer almost made him laugh. My environment is usually rich people pretending to enjoy salmon while discussing taxes. Pamela smiled, despite herself. Fair point. The cookout filled an entire apartment courtyard between 2 brick buildings. Folding tables lined the sidewalks, while music played loudly from portable speakers balanced near open windows. The second Brian stepped out of the car. He immediately felt out of place, not because anyone treated him badly, because everybody actually interacted with each other here. People talked over each other constantly, laughed loudly, shared food without asking formal permission. Somebody argued passionately about basketball near the grill, while another person danced badly with a paper plate in one hand. Children sprinted through the courtyard, chasing bubbles. An older woman adjusted the baby blanket without even introducing herself first. Brian stood frozen beside the stroller, trying to process the amount of noise happening simultaneously. Pamela noticed immediately. You look terrified. Brian lowered his voice. There are so many conversations happening at once. Pamela laughed softly. That's called community. A man working the grill pointed toward Brian immediately. You Pamela's husband? Brian hesitated for half a second. Pamela answered before he could. Ex-husband. The man nodded casually. Ah, so you're the one trying to earn forgiveness. Brian blinked. Pamela covered her mouth, trying not to laugh. The man flipped another burger, calmly. Good luck with that, brother. Brian looked at Pamela quietly after that. You told everybody our business? Pamela grabbed 2 paper plates from the table. No. They figured it out because you look nervous every time somebody mentions relationships. Unfortunately, she was correct. The baby started fussing softly inside the stroller. Before Pamela could move, Brian instinctively reached down first and lifted him carefully. The movement happened naturally now. That mattered. Pamela noticed immediately. So did everybody else nearby. An older woman sitting beneath an umbrella smiled toward Pamela knowingly. Ooh, she said dramatically. He's learning. Brian looked genuinely alarmed. Why does that sound threatening? The entire table laughed. Pamela shook her head, smiling while fixing herself a drink. For the first time in years, Brian spent an afternoon around people who weren't measuring value through status. Nobody cared about his company. Nobody asked about investments. Nobody tried impressing him. One woman spent 20 straight minutes explaining why grocery prices were ruining everybody's patience lately. Another person complained loudly about rent increases while passing Brian homemade macaroni without waiting for an answer. The conversations felt messy, honest, alive. Brian realized something uncomfortable halfway through the afternoon. He couldn't remember the last time people around him spoke this openly, without calculating social advantage first. Pamela sat beside him later, while the baby slept across Brian's chest beneath a small blanket. Music drifted through the courtyard, while people danced badly nearby. Brian watched everything quietly. Pamela studied him for a moment. "You're being weirdly quiet." Brian glanced toward her. "I think I forgot what this feels like." "What?" He looked around slowly. People actually enjoying each other. Pamela's expression softened slightly after that, because, for the first time since the divorce, Brian no longer looked emotionally disconnected from the world around him. He looked present. The conversation happened 3 nights after the cookout. Not planned, not dramatic. The baby finally fell asleep close to midnight, after fighting sleep for nearly 2 hours. Brian paced slowly through the apartment, holding him against his chest while Pamela cleaned bottles near the sink. "You walk too fast," she whispered. Brian looked down immediately. "I do." "You move like you're late for a meeting." Brian slowed his steps awkwardly. "That better?" Pamela nodded while drying her hands. The apartment remained dim, except for the stove light and the television flickering silently in the background. Brian carefully placed the baby into the portable crib beside the couch. For several seconds, both stood there, watching to make sure he stayed asleep. The baby shifted once. Brian froze completely. Pamela fought a smile. "You know he can't smell fear forever, right?" Brian lowered his voice. "I don't trust him." Pamela laughed softly beneath her breath, while moving toward the couch. That laugh stayed in Brian's head longer than it should have. Everything about Pamela felt slightly different lately. Still guarded, still cautious, but warmer around him now. That scared him almost as much as it comforted him. Pamela tucked one leg beneath herself on the couch, while Brian remained standing awkwardly near the kitchen. "You can sit down," she said quietly. Brian sat at the opposite end of the couch. The space between them felt familiar in a strange way. Not hostile anymore, just careful. Rain tapped lightly against the windows again, while traffic hummed somewhere far below. Pamela stared toward the television for a moment before speaking. "You know what the hardest part was?" Brian looked over slowly. "The divorce?" Pamela shook her head faintly. "No." She folded her arms loosely across herself. "The part before that." Brian stayed quiet. Pamela looked down at her hands. "I kept trying to explain what was wrong, without sounding ungrateful. Every word landed carefully, measured, like she had replayed these thoughts privately for years. You worked hard. You paid for everything. Everybody thought I was lucky." Brian swallowed quietly. "But I felt alone, almost all the time." He lowered his eyes briefly. Pamela continued before he could interrupt. "And the worst part?" She laughed softly, without humor. "You genuinely thought you were loving me properly." Brian leaned back slowly against the couch. Because she was right. That was the painful part. He truly believed financial security automatically translated into emotional care. Pamela looked toward him now. "You stopped talking to me about real things." Brian rubbed his hands together quietly. "I talked to you." "No." Pamela shook her head. "You updated me." That sentence sat heavily between them, because Brian immediately understood the difference. Business schedules, travel plans, meetings, deadlines. He gave Pamela information, not intimacy. Pamela's voice softened slightly. "I used to sit beside you while you answered emails for hours, hoping eventually you'd notice I stopped speaking." Brian closed his eyes briefly. Several memories surfaced immediately. Pamela staring out restaurant windows quietly. Pamela falling asleep alone during movie nights because Brian kept working on his laptop. Pamela asking simple questions and getting distracted answers in return. At the time, he convinced himself exhaustion explained everything. Now he realized something uglier. He had trained himself to prioritize productivity over presence so completely that eventually even love started feeling scheduled. Pamela leaned her head back against the couch cushion tiredly. "I didn't leave because you cheated." Brian looked at her carefully. "I left because I started feeling emotionally invisible inside my own marriage." The apartment became very still after that. No anger, no shouting. Just truth finally sitting in the open between them where both could see it clearly. And for once, Brian didn't try defending himself. Brian's assistant stopped asking questions after the third canceled dinner reservation. Not personal dinner, corporate ones. Investor meetings moved earlier now, because Brian refused late-night scheduling unless absolutely necessary. Magazine interviews got shortened. Weekend retreats disappeared completely from his calendar. People noticed, especially the board members. Brian noticed too, and strangely, he did not miss any of it. One Tuesday afternoon, Brian sat cross-legged on Pamela's apartment floor helping assemble a baby playpen while wearing sweatpants and one sock. The instruction manual rested upside down beside him. Pamela watched from the couch, holding the baby while trying not to laugh. "You build companies faster than this." Brian tightened something aggressively with the tiny wrench. "Companies don't come with cartoon instruction diagrams." Pamela looked down at the manual. "The giraffe picture seems pretty clear." Brian gave her a flat look. "The giraffe is mocking me." The baby kicked excitedly against Pamela's lap, while Brian struggled with another panel. Eventually, the entire side collapsed sideways. Pamela burst into laughter immediately. Brian pointed at the playpen accusingly. "This thing was designed by evil people." Pamela shook her head, smiling. "You always get mad when you can't solve things instantly." Brian paused slightly after hearing that, because she wasn't only talking about the playpen. He understood that now. Instead of defending himself, Brian leaned back against the couch and sighed. "Fair." Pamela noticed the difference immediately. The old Brian would have turned the conversation into an argument to protect his ego. This version listened first. That mattered more than he realized. The baby suddenly grabbed onto Brian's sleeve while making excited sounds. Brian looked down immediately. "Well, somebody still believes in me." Pamela smiled, watching them. That sight still affected her emotionally sometimes. Brian fully engaged, fully present, not distracted by emails, not halfway inside another meeting mentally. Actually there. The apartment felt warmer lately because of that, not because life suddenly became perfect. Bills still existed. The baby still woke up, unpredictably. Pamela still carried lingering fear that consistency could disappear again. But the atmosphere changed. Small routines started forming naturally. Brian arriving before dinner, helping with baths, falling asleep accidentally during children's cartoons, learning grocery lists, remembering doctor appointment times without reminder. Ordinary things. That was the important part. Ordinary love had finally started replacing performance. Pamela noticed it one evening, while folding laundry beside him. Brian sat on the floor, sorting baby clothes by size, with complete concentration. "You're doing it wrong," Pamela said. Brian looked offended instantly. "These are clearly organized. You put socks with bibs. They're both small." Pamela laughed under her breath while fixing the pile. Brian watched her for a second, then reached over instinctively and brushed lint from her sleeve. The movement happened naturally. Neither reacted immediately afterward. That silence felt different now, not uncomfortable, aware. Pamela looked back down at the laundry slowly. Brian did the same. But something subtle shifted between them anyway. Not dramatic romance. Something steadier, safer. Later that night, Pamela found Brian asleep on the couch holding the baby against his chest while some documentary played quietly on television. His glasses had slipped slightly down his nose. One hand still rested protectively across the baby's back, even in sleep. Pamela stood there watching for several seconds. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of fear, she felt peace, small, fragile, but real. And after everything they destroyed together, that feeling mattered more than grand promises ever could. The phone call came on a Friday morning. Brian already knew it would be a problem the second he saw the board chairman's name flash across the screen. Pamela noticed his expression immediately from across the kitchen. The baby sat in a high chair throwing cereal onto the floor with impressive commitment, while Pamela packed the diaper bag for a pediatric follow-up appointment. Brian answered the call carefully. "Morning." The response came instantly. "We moved the investor event to tonight." Brian frowned. "That's impossible." "Not really." Brian walked toward the window automatically while listening. Tonight mattered, not socially, financially. Several international investors had flown into Chicago specifically for the event. The company had spent months preparing presentations, negotiations, and press coverage. Old Brian would have canceled everything else without hesitation. Pamela pretended not to listen from the kitchen, but Brian noticed how her movements slowed slightly. The board chairman continued talking. "We need you there by 7. Brian checked the clock instinctively. The baby's appointment started at 6. Pamela finally spoke quietly, while zipping the diaper bag. "It's okay." Brian looked toward her immediately. Her expression stayed neutral, too neutral. "I can handle the appointment." That sentence bothered him instantly. Not because she sounded angry, because she sounded prepared. Prepared for disappointment. Brian recognized that tone now. The careful emotional distance people develop when they stop expecting reliability. The board chairman kept talking through the phone. Brian rubbed his forehead slowly. "I heard you. We already confirmed media attendance." Pamela avoided looking directly at him now, while wiping cereal from the baby tray. Brian noticed every small thing. The way she stopped talking casually. The way her shoulders tightened slightly. The way she suddenly focused too hard on simple tasks. Not dramatic, not emotional. Just guarded, like she was quietly reminding herself not to expect too much. That realization hit harder than pressure from investors ever could. Brian looked at the baby next. Tiny hands, smashing cereal pieces happily against the tray, without understanding adult tension filling the room. And suddenly Brian saw the exact future he almost created permanently. A child growing up watching his father prioritize work every single time responsibility and family collided. The same cycle, repeated again. The board chairman's voice sharpened slightly. "We cannot afford mistakes tonight." Brian looked down at the floor briefly, then asked calmly, "What happens if I miss one investor dinner?" Silence. The board chairman sounded confused now. "What?" Brian's voice stayed steady. "I asked what happens." Another pause. Then, "You know how important perception is." Brian almost laughed at that. Perception. He spent years protecting public perception, while privately destroying his marriage through absence. Pamela picked up the baby carefully from the high chair and moved toward the sink without interrupting, still giving him space to choose. That somehow made the decision harder emotionally, because she wasn't demanding anything anymore. She was simply watching who he would become next. Brian finally answered the phone. "I won't be there tonight." The silence afterwards stretched several seconds too long. "You're serious?" "Yes. We already announced your attendance publicly." Brian looked toward Pamela again. She had completely stopped moving now, watching him carefully, without realizing. For once, Brian did not feel trapped between work and family. The truth felt painfully simple now. One side of his life made him rich. The other made him human. The board chairman lowered his voice. "This could cost us." Brian nodded once to himself. "Then it costs us." He ended the call before anyone could argue further. The apartment became completely quiet afterward. Pamela stared at him across the kitchen, not smiling, not emotional, just stunned. Because the old Brian would never have chosen this room over that boardroom. Never. The music reached the street before Brian even parked the car. Laughter followed right behind it. Pamela smiled immediately while looking out the window. "That means we're late." Brian checked the dashboard clock. "We're 7 minutes late." Pamela opened the door, already laughing. "You clearly didn't grow up around black family cookouts." The baby bounced excitedly in the car seat while Brian carefully unbuckled him. Months ago, even handling the stroller used to stress him out. Now his hands moved automatically. Bag first, bottle tucked into side pocket, blanket adjusted properly against the evening breeze. Pamela noticed those details constantly now, even when she pretended not to. The cookout filled the entire backyard behind Pamela's cousin's building in South London. Music blasted from portable speakers balanced near folding tables while children sprinted across the grass chasing each other with glowing bracelets. Smoke from the grill drifted through the warm evening air. People danced badly without shame. Somebody argued loudly about old music near the food table, while another person handed out drinks nobody asked for. The energy wrapped around Brian immediately. Chaotic, warm, alive. Very different from the polished business parties he used to attend where everybody performed success carefully. Here, nobody cared about image management. One older woman spotted Pamela instantly. "There goes my girl." Pamela laughed while hugging her one-handed. Brian adjusted the baby against his chest, while several people greeted him casually now, instead of cautiously like the first cookout months earlier. That mattered. He had stopped looking like a visitor. The baby grabbed onto Brian's collar while staring curiously at the lights hanging across the backyard fence. Pamela smiled, watching them. "You know he likes being carried by you now." Brian looked down proudly. "Obviously. I'm elite." Pamela rolled her eyes. You still say things like a CEO sometimes. Recovery takes time. Pamela laughed again while reaching for 2 paper plates from the food table. Brian followed beside her naturally. Not behind, not separate, beside her. That difference mattered too. Music shifted louder across the yard while somebody pulled another person into dancing near the grill. Children screamed happily somewhere behind them. A basketball bounced repeatedly near the driveway. The baby started laughing suddenly after somebody nearby made a ridiculous face at him. Brian froze slightly hearing it, not because the sound was rare anymore, because every time it happened, something inside him still softened immediately. Pamela noticed. She always noticed. You still react like that every single time, she teased. Brian looked down at the baby, smiling against his shoulder. I can't help it. Pamela studied him quietly after that. The old Brian would have checked his phone every few minutes by now, responding to emails, watching stock updates, taking calls outside. Tonight his phone remained forgotten inside his jacket pocket. Hours passed without him touching it once. That mattered more to Pamela than expensive apologies ever did, because presence cannot be faked consistently. Later in the evening, Brian sat beneath hanging lights while the baby slept peacefully against his chest. People danced nearby, while music echoed softly through the backyard. Pamela stood a few feet away laughing during conversation, before suddenly looking toward him and stopping. Brian looked up slowly. Their eyes met across the noise and movement around them. For a second, neither spoke. Pamela noticed something quietly devastating in that moment. Brian was fully there, not distracted, not divided mentally, not halfway inside another meeting or phone call. Present, completely. The realization settled into her slowly, while warm music drifted through the night air around them. And after everything they survived, everything they lost, everything they rebuilt carefully piece by piece, that simple presence somehow felt more romantic than all the luxury Brian once tried replacing love with. Brian smiled faintly toward her from across the yard. Pamela smiled back, small, real, hopeful, and this time, neither of them looked away first.